Sarah through Camp Mishitanki, which was the transplant camp that helped seed North Star Reach. And we connected immediately around talking about poetry and writing, and Cody through his teaching and work at the University of Michigan, and just a really accomplished poet. So we're really honored to have them both here today, and to have all of you. We've got about 20 people in the room. We know there are a lot of healthcare professionals out there. We have some friends joining us from all the way from Sarah's down in Florida, and yeah, some close friends with us here as well. And so just to say a little bit about this breakout session, it's a little different from some of the other sessions that we have offered. And that's partly, I brought up the possibility of hosting this with my colleagues because of my own background and interest in creative writing, both writing fiction and teaching storytelling to kids. And fiction has always been my first love, and is something that has been a really important part of my life. And I've always been a little intimidated by poetry, even though I love it and have friends who are poets, but have just felt a little intimidated, like the long form, sustained form of novels and short stories has just felt a little more accessible to me. But I myself, like many of the presenters here, have had my own journey as real challenges as a caregiver for my parents, certainly in the last 3 to 4 years, and we lost some family members in the last year and a half, and found for me that, like Lynn was saying earlier, I was in a fog. I was exhausted, and I couldn't read. It felt like a real loss to me that I was no longer reading. I was no longer writing, but poems were there. And I developed a new relationship with poetry. And so I'm delighted to have two people who, both Sarah through her work, both of them as practicing poets, and Sarah who with her work at the hospital, and Cody with just, it's his life to be teaching and working as a poet, to come and help share, for my own curiosity as well, like how poetry can be a companion for us in times of loss and grief. So that just tees up kind of our time together. The way this is gonna, we've structured this is that I'm gonna ask them both to share a little bit about how they came to poetry, because I'm imagine there are those of you out there who are writing and maybe interested in how to make poetry more a part of your life, for them to share some of their own poems and talk a little bit about the process, and maybe some things that surprised them, how the writing helped them through some times of loss and grief. And if we have time, I've asked them to pick some poets that they turn to, particularly in the past year, and we can have a conversation about that. And then finally, to share some resources, so that if you would like to make poetry more part of your everyday life, if you're looking to make it a practice, we'll offer some resources for that as well. So with that, I'm gonna just do a formal introduction for both of them, and then I'm gonna turn to Sarah, and we'll have a little conversation with her, and then we'll move over to Cody. And I'm gonna call up the chat too, so don't hesitate to ask questions as we go. Certainly you can raise your hand, or we'll leave time for some Q&A at the end. So welcome again. Sarah O'Donnell Adler is a rabbi and a board certified chaplain at the University of Michigan Health System. Her poetry has appeared in Poetica magazine, the Bear River Review, and the Journal for Jewish Spiritual Care, among others. Cody Walker directs the University of Michigan undergraduate creative writing program, and is also co-director of the Bear River Writers Conference, a 4-day conference featuring workshops in poetry, fiction, and nonfiction based at Camp Michigania. See, we have a very strong camp theme going on here. He is author of 2 full-length poetry collections, and his poems have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Yale Review, and Best American Poetry, among others. So I've asked them both, and as I said, I'm going to turn to Sarah first, who I don't know if those of you heard when you joined on, but she's joining us from Florida. She's down visiting her parents, and we're really happy that she was able to make the time. Just to share a little bit about how you came to poetry, and particularly writing poetry, and then to talk a little bit about how you're weaving it into your work at the hospital, and I'll ask you to read one of your poems after we have this little conversation.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having us today. I began to discover poetry in high school. Um, I am very fortunate that I had a couple of wonderful English teachers in high school. And I think just going through adolescence, it's a pretty confusing time of life for many. And poetry gave me a new way of expressing things. And I remember being lit up by looking at poems by E. E. Cummings and Walt Whitman. At one point, I had the fortune of being able to go to study abroad in Israel for a couple of months. And that experience, I think, also tapped into my own spiritual journey, my own awakening to who I was as somebody who was connected to a much larger history, a larger peoplehood, a larger community. And discovering that there are other Jewish poets helped me understand a little bit more about what Judaism meant to me personally. And so I began reading poets like Yehuda Amichai, and really resonating with some of the themes that were in there. So that's really when I began to love poetry. Later, when I entered, I had decided on going into the rabbinate, and spent time in rabbinical school in New York City, and um, fell in love with the Psalms, with the Hebrew prayer book, which really is poetry. And when we look for comfort in prayer, for me, it was an experience of opening up a book that had poems that were recorded that were hundreds of years old, thousands of years old, some of them, and being able to find connection, the rhythm of reading the same things over and over again on a daily, weekly basis, just gave some kind of order and comfort zone in navigating a world that was sometimes difficult. So that's where my love of poetry really took root. Um, and I'll share also that as we're studying sacred text, seminary tended to be more academic than I had anticipated. We're doing a lot of biblical criticism, and the stories that I really wanted to connect with were less accessible. But when I was able to look at biblical characters um, as being people who had the same challenges in
Hi,
life.
Jan. It's Lisa.
But I think that poetry allowed me to access stories that were in our sacred literature that were sometimes less able to access. And you'll see, like in the poem that I'm going to read in a little bit, is an example of how I did that. Um, but as chaplains, in terms of my work as a chaplain, what poetry really taught me to do is to take notice. I think when we read a poem, it causes us to slow down, to pause, to think carefully about why words are chosen the way they're chosen, why they're laid out on a page a certain way. And when I work with people, when I have the privilege of meeting patients and families in the hospital, I have to use that same skill. The skills that I developed in reading poems are the same skills that I try to use when I'm working with people, to slow down, to take notice. As people share their stories with me, there's a reason they're telling me what they're telling me at any given moment. And so I try to listen to them the way I might try to listen to a poem, if that makes sense. So I feel that by hearing the stories, framing it a little bit, hearing about grief, about loss, about the challenges of living with illness. Um, there's also the call to try to lift up what I've heard in prayer, because that's the work that I do as a chaplain. So, so using prayer to frame a story, to frame the challenges that people come with, is part of my life work right now.
That's beautiful. Yeah, when Sarah was sharing some of the active work she's doing and just what she shared with all of you, even though I have had conversations with Sarah about writing, it hadn't occurred to me how you're weaving it in that way and how important that is. I'd love for you to read this the poem Chaplain. And I have a few. I think that question of with this poem, for you to talk a little bit about, you know, what you just mentioned about bringing in kind of other biblical references, like sort of that context, that conversation across time. You know, it's your poem can be a conversation with yourself. It can be a conversation with your loved ones, this community here today, but it's also um, a conversation across time. So why don't we listen to you read, and I'll just ask a few more questions, and then we'll have a conversation with Cody as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so Chaplain. Through the cobalt of winter, a day is rising. Masked and badged, I move toward the steps that spill from the hospital doors. But first, notice how a finger of sunlight wraps a sliver on panes of windows where children sleep by the soft beep of machines and parents knit their brows in concern. Breath almost visible, I stand in the beginning day as bicycles tick past and commuters murmur on muted cell phones. Here by the path, I recognize a familiar rock. It is Jacob's pillow. I want to lay myself down before dawn stands and shouts the birds awake. This place on the hill, this ladder, this palace of broken bodies, this portal where souls break free to heaven, while others, like stardust, spiral down into arms of new mothers. Let me lay down here just this once. Let me find God in this place and know it. Clutching coffee cups, interns in white coats revolve through morning doors, ride the elevators up and down. I wrestle every day with the why and limp into another day, breaking.
Thank you. I imagine there are many in the room right now who, just through your description of the hospital, is very familiar to them. Anyone who works at Michigan Medicine or any hospital, really, but very vivid descriptions of kind of that world, and such insight into kind of your experiences as, you know, part of the spiritual care team and as a rabbi. Um, it was one of the questions, two questions really, when you, and I think this is interesting to people who don't, particularly who don't, well, anyone really, but who don't write poetry, like the process, like what you start out maybe with a question or something you want to explore. And was there a moment in the writing where it took a turn? Because I feel it as as a listener, it's, it takes surprising turns. And if you could just talk about maybe a couple moments where it was almost like some other part of you was like, no, I want you to think about this. No, I want you,
Um, yeah, well, I think it came later, the connection to Jacob's ladder, for me. A story where he lays down and he has this vision of a ladder going to heaven, um, and then waking up saying, "God was in this place and I did not know it." Um, because mornings, like the poem was born years ago actually, and it sat in my computer untouched for a really long time, because I was really focused on just trying to capture what it was like to walk into the building in the morning. Because sometimes it was hard to do. Some days are just hard to walk into the doors not knowing what awaits us. Um, and I was my the way my commute used to take me was over the lawn near the cardiovascular center and children's hospital, and just kind of looking at the sun rising, um, in the new day going into it. And it was a beautiful setting. Um, but as they've unearthed it, now there's a new hospital being built on the grounds, and the commute is very different because it sat on my computer so long. But I just realized that at one point, like, what is the meaning? Like, I don't have the answers. Like, I think I struggle to understand, even as a chaplain. Because we're religious, because we're clergy, we don't have the answers when we work with people. We don't presume to know why things happen, but we can sit with people and try to make meaning out of it. And I think that's what this poem did for me, was that is just recognizing that there are moments that all of us might carry a flash of doubt, the question of why and wanting to know why, but not having the answer to why. Um, but but despite not knowing, we can still create some meaning out of it, knowing that, as you mentioned, Amy, being connected across the years, that we're all part of a larger narrative. We're all part of a larger story. Um, so that's the meaning that I try to bring to it. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. And did it um was it when you were working with the words that kind of drew you into more questioning, or was it that you had composed on the page, like you said, it was in your computer and you were writing to work and you thought, like, I'm always interested in whether it's the language that in working and kind of needing the language that draws you in, and oftentimes it's both. It's, you can't sort of clearly define it, but um I think of someone like Cody's wife is a short story writer, and I think very much with Polly, it's like a language is a dough. You knead it, and it gets warmer and warmer, and you work the words and and it opens up. And while it's both, I just wonder if, even because you're spending so much time walking in this space of the hospital, that it's almost percolating away from the page.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had to go away from it for me to see it in a different way, and then to
Yeah, yeah,
reshape it. Um,
yeah.
so that the editing, like editing something, is writing, and that's, to me, sometimes the more fun part of it, is to, like, I love what you said about kneading things like dough. I think there's a lot of truth in that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but stepping away from it and then being able to bring the lens of, the biblical story for me, then it began to fit together a little bit more. But I wouldn't have come to that had I tried to hammer the whole thing out in one setting. Some poems do come out in one setting, like some things I can write really quickly, and others, like this one, might sit and take me quite a while, over
Yeah.
years. So
Yeah, wonderful. I think there's something, and this is a nice segue to Cody. So when you were writing, I know this in kind of the long form and not so much in poetry, but that um, when you're stuck and you feel like you don't know where to go, to take a leap, or to connect to it, to me it goes back to conversations, like, can you have a conversation with another author, or can you have a conversation with an author long past, or it's kind of like just something that can help um, create that shift of perspective to kind of get you out. And for poetry. And for Cody, I think just the form, it's such a, it has the form itself. And if we, I don't want you to read your poem yet, because I want you to talk a little bit about kind of, but you work very much with formal structure. I mean, you know, and rhyme and stand, you know, and that kind of provides, sometimes I think the fiction writers are envious of the, well, both envious of the poets and their forms, but also not wanting to feel like we're handcuffed by those forms. But, you know, often you know, the best creativity comes when you have more limits, like you're creating within the, but so anyway, I'm gonna segue to Cody after that little ramble, and just ask you to share a little bit about how you you know, you came to poetry, and I'm just a little bit about whether you thought you were going to be making a living as teaching poetry and as a someone who's, you know, it's your livelihood, and yeah, and then we'll kind of transition to your poem.
Yeah, thank you. I am, wow. It's weird being a panelist because you have some things you think you're going to say, and then I hear this conversation. I'm just jotting all these notes down, and I just want to talk about things that Sarah just said, or I want to talk about this idea of poetry as conversation. My first book actually ends with a series of letters addressed to Walt Whitman from his imagined grandson back in the late 1880s and early 1890s, and so there's kind of a literal conversation that I'm trying to construct. But I love that idea that poetry, it's always a conversation. I tell my students this, that if you're writing a poem, you are in some ways adding to this conversation that's been going on for a few thousand years, and cross fingers will continue for a few thousand years. And you're changing it ever so slightly by entering into it. There's this great, I'm not going to do justice to this, but there's a story of Borges in the Sahara, and he takes up a little bit of sand and he just kind of goes like this, and somebody says, "Borges, what are you doing?" And he says, "I am modifying the Sahara." So we're always just kind of modifying the Sahara in these small small ways, and that seems like something, it's not nothing, and I love that idea. I loved, I found myself just nodding to almost everything that Sarah was saying, and kind of, but for the biographical details, have, kind of a similar story where I was, in, I don't, certainly by high school, maybe middle school, but certainly high school, just finding myself drawn to the idea of wanting to put words on a page in some way or another. And Amy, you and I have never talked about this, but I was Amy is a great tennis player, for those who don't know. And I'm not, but I was the court attendant at a tennis court when I was in high school for a few years. And so I'd have all these schedule sheets, back when, people just had to pencil on the bulletin board when they were going to play. And I would just use this as scrap paper. So I still have some of them, just, these old tennis schedule sheets with poems and songs and the beginnings of stories and things like that. And it just, more and more became part of who I thought I was. I don't remember, to answer your question specifically, Amy, I don't remember if I ever thought I would make a living doing this, or I doubt it. But I kept coming back to it. It kept being something that gave me pleasure. I liked the way that words collided with words. I liked that energy. And I liked it in different forms as well, but poetry is probably the form that I have come back to more than any other. Um, I was also, like Sarah, I was abroad, and when I was in Thailand, when I was about 22, I ended up doing this project where I was kind of investigating. I mean, this is an academic project, but I was investigating the period in Thailand between 1973 and 76, where there was this kind of unusual democratic interregnum, bounded by military dictatorships on either side. And I thought I was going to, write some kind of long academic paper about it. And I ended up gathering the material and interviewing people, but then pouring it all into poetry and writing what was kind of essentially a second undergraduate thesis, kind of a poetic exploration of that time. And it just became more and more the way that I processed the world around me. So then it made sense for me eventually to get an MFA in poetry and then to get a PhD in English lit, but I still kind of hung out with the poetry crowd, and people thought I was probably getting an MFA when I was getting a PhD. And yeah, at that point I'd done enough teaching of poetry both to kids and writers in the schools programs and at the college level that I did start to think this is probably what I'm part of what I'm doing with my life and how I'm going to make a living. But more important than that, it was just what I love to do. I was thinking, I was making some notes about some things that Sarah said, and that idea of it being kind of a comfort zone, or poetry being something that the reading of it, I think, slowing you down is part of it, but also the writing of it. I mean, because I write small poems usually, but sometimes they take a while. So I'm just kind of in that, with all the busyness that's happening, I'm slowing down. I'm, looking, if I'm at a coffee shop and somebody sees me, there's a guy who is not doing anything. That's what I look like. And this is back in the days of coffee shops. I know they don't exist anymore, but back when we had coffee shops, just kind of just staring at a page and then every once in a while going like that and then erasing it and then putting back what I put a moment ago. And that's fun for me. And I don't know that that's fun for everybody, but I enjoy that. And I was thinking also about this idea of slowing down, that during, I think we're probably going to talk about COVID year to some extent, and during this year of everything kind of slowing down, um, every morning in my inbox, I would get a couple of daily poems from, Poem a Day or the Poetry Foundation or the Academy of American Poets. And during other years when I'm doing a million things, I might not always read those poems, but this past year when I was certainly less busy in the mornings, I would always take the time to read them and sit with them and sometimes copy them and paste them into a kind of a growing document where I ended up having this kind of commonplace book of, or maybe document, not book, but a document of things that spoke to me during this year that, was tough for me and tough for a lot of people. And that's something that I read over when Amy talked to Sarah and I about, um, thinking about what we might bring to this
Yeah.
panel and thinking about how those poems have been a comfort for me, or a way to reframe the day or the week, or something beyond that. Some of the poems were poems I knew really well, and I was so happy to see an old friend who I needed that particular morning. And other times it was a new poem, and I thought, wow, I'm gonna be friends with this poem forever now. So I mean,
Could
yeah,
you talk a little bit about, I mean, to move from the receiving poems and to have you read your poem and to share a little bit about how it's, I don't know enough of your work to say it's a departure, but from the work that I know, Cody, the work that I'm familiar with is more on kind of the humor, political side. And this is a very personal poem. And just sort of asking him, maybe you could read it and then maybe share a little bit about how, as you said, it sort of jumped, these poems jumped out at you
yeah,
after you were looking over your body of work.
yeah, sure. So I was putting together a manuscript a few weeks ago, potential manuscript anyway, and looking at a lot of the poems that I wrote from, say, the 2015 to 2020. And as Amy said, we all know what happened in 2016. So the political landscape occupied a lot of my attention. And I was writing a poem every day for 5 years. This was my little kind of gimmick or shtick, where so I wrote 1,826 poems during these 5 years, and most of them are not poems I, need to look at again. And many of them were about just whatever sort of political outrage was happening that morning or that evening. But there were also poems that were popping up along the way that dealt with my mother's Alzheimer's, and she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's about a decade ago, and especially in the last 5 years, as we all know happens, the decline has been, kind of steady, and then even more so in the last few years. And some of those poems that I was writing about her were ones that, when I was putting this manuscript together, felt more worth returning to than, yet another poem about Mike Pence or something. So I'll read one of those, and it's a real short one, and it does something that I sometimes do, which is to Amy had mentioned my interest in form. To use a form that usually would be used for light verse purposes, but to see if I could say something more serious within it. So this is a poem called The Mad Gardener's Song that Lewis Carroll invented, and they're spread through a couple of later books, not the Alice books, but some later books he wrote called Sylvie and Bruno. And they always go, he thought he saw a blah, 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 that blah, 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 blah. He looked again and found it was a blah, 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 blah. He said blah, 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 blah. And you just fill in the blahs. So they're relatively easy to write. He wrote 9 of them. I've written, I think, about 500 at this point. And some of them are indeed light verse. The one I'm going to read to you is not, but it uses that form. It's called Mad Cognitive Decline. It's in 2 short parts. Mad cognitive decline. 1. She thought she saw a rhododendron, augury of danger. She looked again and found it was her shadow. I can change her. I'll bring her cups of tea so she won't see me as a stranger. 2. He thought he saw a Mother's Day on Sunday, like before. He looked again and found it was an open cellar door. Perhaps it leads to moments we won't speak of anymore. And that's it. And that's, again, that's kind of a comic form, but not comic subject matter.
And it was actually, these fell into place organically, but I think it's an interesting contrast if we think about poems and if people are interested in writing. For me anyway, one of the first things I think of is to create what feels like for me, a safe space. I often need a safe space to write. Is who is my audience? Who am I speaking to? And Sarah felt it could have been a conversation with herself, it's like you're kind of shadowing, Sarah's journey, whereas Cody's is very much, you're kind of almost watching, it's a two voices, 2 characters sort of having, and it's the mirroring of you've got dialogue, you have very fictional techniques, really. So to ask the question that might, for people that are thinking about whether it's writing anything, but sort of the question, when you start something like this, and it could be that you were referencing, like you said, across time, other poets, do you think of audience? Did that help you? Is that a starting place for you to think about, is this a conversation with your mom? I mean, to sort of make the leap into asking a personal question, or just you're kind of playing with a moment, but it goes back to the question of audience and sort of that conversation.
That's to me. That
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
For me anyway. I mean, it is a conversation with my mom in kind of the most maybe deeply imaginative sense, but not in a literal sense. And my mother I can still have a conversation with her on the phone, but she doesn't have any short-term memory, and she wouldn't be able to track that. If I were reading her a poem, she wouldn't understand that. So it's not something, I wouldn't think of her as an audience member. And I mean, it really, I it's a conversation I'm having with myself more than anybody else. And kind of again in that space, and the word a different world, the coffee shop, or lately just on my couch, just a time to kind of go in when so much of life is going out. And I mean, another thing I was thinking that maybe relates to the general topic of this conference is that often I feel like I write a bunch of silly stuff and political stuff and, kind of throwaway stuff. But if I'm writing something that's a little more serious, or that surprises, or that where I'm surprised, here I was talking about surprise. The second poem I have on tap that we may or may not get to is one that more kind of, I really welcome that. I believe in Robert Frost's idea of no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader, but that surprise is contagious and a pleasure. And I also believe in this idea that it gets attributed to the blues singer Willie Dixon, but others have said it as well, that I sing the blues to get myself out of the blues. So when I'm writing, if I'm writing something and suddenly I'm writing something that's kind of depressing and heavy, it doesn't make me feel depressed or heavier. I kind of feel a little more buoyant that I get to play with the rhyme or the rhythm or something like that within that space. And it does kind of, if anything, lift me out of it rather than take me in a negative sense anyway, deeper into it.
That's lovely. Um, so this may have come up in our conversation before everyone joined, but I'm keeping an eye on the time and we have maybe less than 5 minutes. I'm hoping, I know we'll just have to have another conversation another time, but I would love, because I was interested in having you talk about kind of your own writing process and share a poem as one way to think about poetry, but also what you seek from reading published poets. So just to bring this to a close and kind of leave people with some poetry, I think we have enough time for you both to read one of the published poems that you had selected, and then we, just for everyone to know, we will share resources, both the poems that they read, Sarah and Cody read, the published poems, as well as some resources like where you can get, a poem a day, where you, if Sarah, I'm just going to jump in just in the interest of time, but in with her chaplaincy work, they have, I believe it's a daily huddle where one of the things they do is they share a poem or a prayer. And I think just thinking about, if you're interested, kind of the ways in which you can create it to be a habit or kind of a practice in your life. But is that okay if we close with, I just think it would be lovely for people to hear your beautiful readers and to kind of have that sort of take us out of our time together.
Sure. Would you like me to go first or?
Yeah, and you pick which, I know we had a couple picked, but
Yeah, I'm going to choose a poem called The Trees by Philip Larkin. The trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said. The recent buds relax and spread. Their greenness is a kind of grief. Is it that they are born again and we grow old? No, they die too. Their yearly trick of looking new is written down in rings of grain. Yet still the unresting castles thresh in full-grown thickness every May. Last year is dead, they seem to say. Begin afresh, afresh, afresh.
thank you.
Mm.
That was beautiful.
I love that poem by Larkin so much, and I would I would say things about it if we had time, but I'm going to instead choose the shortest of the poems that I had on tap. Although I deeply encourage people to go find Wisława Szymborska's Miracle Fair, which is too long to read right now, but is maybe my favorite of all the poems that I had pulled up. But here's one that by Lucille Clifton called "Blessing the Boats," which had a lot of kind of currency over the past year. I saw it bouncing around from time to time in the different kind of social media sites I glance at. You'll understand why. Blessing the Boats goes like this. May the tide that is entering even now the lip of our understanding carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love your back. May you open your eyes to water, water waving forever, and may you, in your innocence, sail through this to that. And 2020 has given us a lot of this, so I think we're ready for some of that.
That was beautiful. Thank you. We do we do have time if anyone, if people want to turn on their cameras or ask a question. Um, I think we've got just a couple of minutes before we go into
Can
the
I
next.
ask Cody a question? Cody, you mentioned that it's been, I think you mentioned 2016 as a hard year, this 2020 is a hard year, and that you kept notes about things that were hard and then you wrote about that. Can you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I guess two different ways to imagine that. So I wrote poem that I just shared with a very select number of people, one of whom is on this call right now. But these weren't things I was, for the most part, sending to journals or imagining putting in books. Yeah, every day for 5 years, and then I stopped that at the beginning of 2020. For I could not have predicted that COVID was going to hit us all in a couple of months, but it probably turned out to be the right thing because I feel like I needed to kind of change that frantic energy of writing, 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 and following the news, following the news, following the news, and kind of reflect and process and also just read. And so I started reading more. And so those poems I was reading, often that were coming in these different poem a day sites that Amy's going to share with people, I would, if I loved them as I often did, I would just copy them from my email and put them in this growing document that I would occasionally return to. And it made me feel a little bit better, you know, as poetry sometimes does.
Thank you.
For those of you who might be interested in writing, just sort of keeping a journal and just even if you have 2 to 3 minutes, even just to kind of touch the page, I think will I know for myself, sometimes even finding that time can be hard, but it's it for, I think when you're by yourself and you touch the page with words, it can feel like a sacred space that I know for me, it's my spiritual practice. People have all sorts, but so I hope this conversation has, it's certainly been a joy to hear both of you share about your writing. Thank you so much for sharing a poem. I'm sorry we didn't have time. You guys, we had so much teed up. We had like 3 hours of conversation, and I'm sorry we spent 5 minutes having a little chat while you guys were joining us. But anyway,
Amy, thank you
that's
for organizing this. It's lovely. And Sarah, thank you, thank you, thank
yeah,
you.
Thank you, Cody.
yeah,
Thank you, Amy, and everyone. This has been really lovely to be a part
yeah.
of.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I think you can leave the room, and like we've said, we will share resources. And just thank you, everyone, again for joining, Sarah and Cody for making the time. And I hope those of you who can stay for the next breakout and the closing presentation, we'll look forward to seeing you back in the main room. So bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.